My name is Daniel Farki, and I'm, along with my colleagues Hedjan and Nestan, we're looking at nature and biodiversity finance for GCF. So I thought it wouldn't be fitting for this type of event if I didn't start with a sobering assessment of where we stand on nature and biodiversity. So a few numbers, probably all familiar to most of us. On land, primarily driven by agricultural expansion, we've lost about a third of our forests, which are home to around 80% of amphibian, 75% of bird, and 68% of mammal species. And of the remainder, it's estimated that around 80% has been compromised by human activity in one form or another. Similar story in oceans. We've got over 30% of fish stocks are overfished, but the story goes much, much further than that. Drivers we're all familiar with include unsustainable resource extraction, invasive species, pollution, notably plastic waste, and the list goes on, and all of these things put a huge strain on ecosystems. Climate change is also starting to have a really significant impact through a whole variety of mechanisms. More frequent extreme weather, increasing temperatures, rising ocean salinity, increased wildfires, and this year I think it's been a really stark example of so many of that can feel a bit like the end of times at points. So what do we do? Nature and biodiversity finance has emerged in the last few years as being a really critical part of environmental conservation efforts. It's seeking to channel financial resources towards preservation, restoration, and sustainable management of natural ecosystems and the rich variety of life that they support. Governments, international organizations such as ourselves, and private sector are all increasingly recognizing the economic value of biodiversity, which is, it's something that should be obvious because healthy ecosystems provide essential services to us all, like clean air, clean water, pollination for agriculture, and the food we depend upon. And biodiversity finance is taking a number of interesting forms and mechanisms. We've got biodiversity bonds, green investments of all kinds, conservation funds, and they're all aimed at mobilizing capital for nature-based solutions and protecting biodiversity. And another really critical part, which we're going to hear about, is the importance of valuing and accounting for the contributions that biodiversity makes into economic decision-making. So, bridging the gap between conservation and financial sectors, nature and biodiversity finance aims to play a pivotal role in ensuring the long-term health of our planet. Looking at where we stand with that finance, UNEP has put out an estimate that around $133 billion annually currently go to nature-based solutions, and that's almost all public sector funds. So we really, as we've heard lots of times already today, and we will continue to hear, I guess, if we're really to make put a dent in this problem, we're going to need much, much more private sector. And at GCF's private sector facility, that's more or less exactly what we're aiming to do. We've invested in a few really interesting projects, just to give a couple of examples: the Arboro Fund, the Global Fund for Coral Reefs. But we're aiming to really expand that. And in fact, I joined GCF just over 8 months ago with a mandate to try and build our support in this area, along with my colleagues. So all of that said, I'm really delighted to welcome a really amazing panel we have today of distinguished speakers to discuss the current state of play, look at what we're doing with blended finance and innovative business models and what we can be doing better. We're going to look at the financing gap, developer and investor challenges, and how, as I say, how we can do better with blended finance. So to kick us off, I'd like to invite Lais Braido up to the stage. Lais has been the CFO of Solinftec since 2020, having joined from private equity firm Unbox Capital in Sao Paulo as an investor in the company's Series B round. Lais has over 8 years of experience working in private equity in Brazil and is a graduate of Fundação Getúlio Vargas in Sao Paulo. Lais, please.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Lais from Brazil. I'm CFO at Solinftec. And here we are going to bring our case study as a company invested by GCF. So we have the presentation. technical issues. Yeah, it's okay. So I'll just to keep in time. Maybe I can start here. Oh, great. Thank you. So next page, please. So yeah, so LymphTech is reimagining how farming operations happens in the field. We're bring technology through digital tools, sensors, AI, and robotics in order to monitor, to sense 24/7 every operation that happens inside the farm, from harvesting, spraying, and sowing. Through that, we are able to deliver several efficiencies, reducing dramatically the amount of chemicals being sprayed in the field. With the softwares, we are able to reduce 10 up to 20%. With the robotic solution that I'm going to present, we are reducing to 90% the chemicals sprayed in the field. And this is not a cost-effective solution for farmers, but it's increasing yields and mainly it's protecting soils, health, and it's driving a vicious cycle for agriculture. We received in April 2022 the funding, indirect funding from GCF through the Lightsmith Group, also known as Craft Group. They led our Series C round back then, and since then the company is growing 44%. Right now, we are present in 11 countries, in South and North America mainly, and we aim to expand our technology here to the Africa market as well. I'm going to walk you through what we do here in terms of the technology. So next, I have the clicker here, right? Sorry. Yeah. So first thing, what we do, we deploy sensors in the field in order to get machine telemetry in real time, weather stations in real time, and through that, and also a connectivity network. So also in Brazil, 3G and 4G, this is not a reality in farming areas. So in order to capture data, primary data from field level operations, we get this through our connectivity network, and we get this data and we see that through a digital platform that we call the operational system for farmers. There, we can apply AI and give back also in real time optimal decisions to increase all the efficiencies in how they apply the chemicals, fertilizers, and how they harvest. So here, most important piece is not getting only data in real time, but mainly acting in real time, avoiding inefficiencies in the field. Here I have a real example of how we do this. So this is an example of a spraying operation of chemicals, mainly for row crops operations. So right now, we focus in large-scale agriculture. For you to spray with efficiency a chemical in the field, you need to consider the climate variables in real time, right? So in the prescription of the product, there is all the specifications on the how is the wind, for example. If the wind is too hard, maybe the chemical will drift to a neighbor area, maybe it's an indigenous area. So all these variables, we monitor that in real time, avoiding this type of things and guaranteeing that it's going to where it's supposed to be. And because of that, we are not only adapting in real time to climate change in the operations, but avoiding the losses and efficiencies that farmers face every day, considering several variables they need to take in consideration while taking decisions in the field. And what is next? So through the digital platform, now we are adding another IoT to the system, a robotics platform that will be able to capture agronomy data at scale. Today, farmers, they don't have data. The farmers are analog managed, so because of that, they lack a lot of efficiency in the field. So this machine will be able to run 24/7. It's a solar powered machine. And with cameras, it will be able to scan the fields, considering what type of weed infestation, what type of pest infestation. Is the soil compacted or not? Do you need more fertilization here or not? And with this data, we'll be able to scale how we capture agronomy data at fields. And here is what we see next, how we can transform and rethink from fundamental challenges how the sector is working to capture efficiencies and to reduce to less the impacts on nature. And that's how I'm going to show here an example of how the sprayer Solix platform is dramatically rethinking and reducing the impacts on nature. So first thing, today for you to spray is really expensive. You need a big machine, or you do manually. You spray most of the times 100% of the field. In Brazil, 5 times. For some perennial crops like coffee and citrus, 10, 15 times in the season. So you are spraying chemicals sometimes to kill a pest that is only 1% of the area. All of these chemicals is going to the soil. The soil is losing health, and you need to apply more fertilizers to keep the health. So this is a vicious cycle, really costly vicious cycle. So with this, we bring intelligence in the field with an affordable way to bring data and take decisions. Solix will be able, because it's much less expensive, it will be able to run every 7 days and scan the same plant in the field. And with this diagnosis, we will only spray when needed, and we will spray at an early stage. Farmers won't need to wait 1 month to go there when the weed has already grown up and competed with nutrients with the crop. They can spray much earlier in the season, avoiding it to grow. So it's also reflecting in higher yields after the season. We just ran 14 of these robots units in the season, right now in the US. We have an operation there with different farmers and cooperatives and agri-trailers, and we could prove that we are able to reduce 89.3% all the herbicides being sprayed in the field and increasing 10% yields in the crop. So it's cost effective, it's increasing yields in same areas, and it's protecting nature because we are not losing a lot of chemicals into the soil, and we are avoiding the loss of fertility in the soil. One more thing to mention, it's a light machine, so it's not compacting soil. If it's not compacting soil, you don't need to do tillage. So the carbon that was storage will keep there for a longer time. So also here, soil compaction avoidance in terms of the technology. Here's just a summary of what has been said. I know a lot of people here brought to you all the impacts, the negative impacts we see in agriculture and how agriculture is dependent on climate change, on nature resources, and because of that, how crucial it is for us to adapt, to help farmers to adapt to climate change with the constantly changing variables, and help the nature to preserve the most important resources such as water, such as the soil fertility. So we see, for instance, in the ecosystem, the pollinators, the importance of them for the food ecosystem, and we see a 40% reduction on their population in the recent years because of how inefficient and the amount of chemicals that are being sprayed out there. We also see 20% loss in soil fertility in the recent years. And because of the excessive use of chemicals and fertilizers, we also, the amount that will stay in the soil will also run off into local streams, rivers, and even it will reach the seas and oceans, completely changing their ecosystem. So through that, how we are, through our technology, changing that. So one, with the software and through the digitalization of the farms, reducing 10 up to 20% the inefficiencies and the amounts of inputs being sprayed, also sustaining the productivity of farms. And second, with the Solix robotics that are going to be launched right now in the market, reducing up to 90% of chemicals. And there is a roadmap here, not only for chemicals, we're targeting chemicals before in the investments, but we are also testing right now soil compaction sensors, fertilization sensors in order to make it possible to have a variable rate application and tillage of the farms. So again, a cost-effective solution that will timely respond to any variable that is changing in the field, and that will make it possible much lighter and sustainable agriculture for us. In the future, how we see this? So LinkTech has developed a systemic view of the farm. We understand from sowing to spraying to harvesting every operation that is happening on farm. And through the different technologies, we aim to address regenerative agriculture. Because with a robotic system, an autonomous system, or with the data we are capturing, we are able to live in the field 24/7. And by living in the field, understanding everything that is being changed there, and adapt to everything that is being changed there. So with this, we can coexist. So how we produce food can coexist to the nature, to the planet, to the soil. So this is how we see most of our future. We can also talk about carbon data, how farmers will be, first thing, carbon data is an output that we can bring, but first, let's help farmers to be a net zero, to have a net zero farm first. And here, just to close the presentation, so just to bring more details, in April 2022, the Lightsmith Group, they are based in the US. They mostly focus in climate adaptation and resilience technologies. And they invested in us and with GCF together into our Series C equity round. Right now, what we have as an interaction with them, just to bring to you guys how the interactions are going. So they have a board seat. They can help us a lot with strategic advices. And they were the first international investor outside of Brazil at the company. So it's also helping us to have connections abroad in order for us also to expand abroad. So right now, as I mentioned, we are in 11 countries. We aim to come and bring the technology to Africa. So these connections being here today is also something that is supporting a lot the company development. Also, with the technical assistance grants, they are also supporting through the US government and the Nordic Development Fund, also providing us much more investments for direct impact investments in some Latin America countries, for example, with small farm holders, and future also to invest here to small farm holders in Africa. As I mentioned, the company is growing really fast after the investment, 34%. Right now, we have a recurring revenue service. So right now, we have $60 million in annualized recurring revenue and over 800 employees in the company spread out in South and North America. And GCF questioned me, what is different? So it's pretty much the same. How private equity firms see the process to invest and how it happened for us was pretty much the same. There are some needs on reportings, ESG, the impact KPIs, and sometimes we need to invest and build that. But for us, once we capture data from farms, it's pretty easy for us to demonstrate what are the impacts the technology is bringing inside our customers. Is there time to show the video of the Solix product? Yeah. So, yeah? Great. Just to show a quick video here, guys, on the platform. This is a farm in Brazil. It's a 20-hectare farm. Actually, we call this a net zero farm, where we are testing all the different practices. So the machine will identify and only spray where it identifies a weed infestation. And here, this is how we are managing to buy pests in the field without zero chemical. This is a light frequency that attracts bugs in the field and kill it with a shock. So it's not even using pesticides here to do the crop protection. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Lace. That was great. So now, I'm very excited to welcome a fantastic lineup of panelists. In fact, I'm going to place myself off to one side. So everybody could come up and join me. Gillian Caldwell is Chief Climate Officer and Deputy Assistant Administrator at USAID, where she's responsible for directing and overseeing climate and environment work across the agency. She also oversees DDI's Center for Environment, Energy and Infrastructure and the Office of Environment and Social Risk Management. Prior to joining USAID, Gillian served as the CEO for Global Witness, as well as launching and leading One Sky, a climate-focused legislative campaign. Welcome. Zheng Chu, which I hope I got right, is Program Manager for Nature and Climate Finance at UNEP. Based here in Nairobi, she oversees the development of a portfolio of projects that provide finance, business, and policy solutions for nature and climate. Prior to UNEP, Zheng worked with us at GCF, where she managed a pipeline supporting project development. Zheng holds a master's degree in banking and finance from Monash University. Akif Merchant is Associate Director at Convergence Blended Finance, responsible for providing strategic advice and capacity building support to a range of clients from public, private to philanthropic organizations. And prior to joining Convergence, Akif was a management consultant working at LEC Consulting, Dasra, and Nexus Consulting Groups. Akif holds an MBA and BA from Toronto and George Washington Universities, respectively. Catherine Stodulka is Chair of the Blended Finance Task Force and a partner at Systemic, a system change advisory and investment firm. She helps design blended finance solutions like the Global Fund for Coral Reefs, one of the world's largest adaptation funds, and SDG Namibia One, a new investment platform for green hydrogen. Catherine also advises the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action and is on the board of the G7 Impact Task Force. And somehow I skipped over Dorothy Maseke, who I'm very pleased to welcome, is the Africa lead for Nature Finance and TNFD at FSD Africa, where she leads the Natural Capital and Biodiversity Finance, and TNFD agendas, aiming to catalyze nature-positive finance across Africa. Dorothy is also driving the African Natural Capital Alliance, mobilizing the financial community's response to the risk of nature loss in Africa. Previously, she led the implementation of UNEP FI's Principles of Sustainable Insurance at ICEA Lion Group and has represented Africa in task forces such as the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures and the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials. So please join me in welcoming everybody. So, Akif, I thought I'd start with you. Can you give us an example or two of a recent development which illustrates some of the positive momentum behind financing for nature, or an example of perhaps some of the challenges or the remaining gaps that we have?
So I think one of the positive developments that we've seen in financing for nature over the last year and a half is an increasing interest and participation from institutional investors in the space. AXA, the French insurance company, recently launched their natural capital investing strategy with a total corpus of around 500 million euros. The strategy is to make direct equity investments in transactions and also do some project finance. One of the transactions that they've supported is a Brazilian-based organization called Mombac, where they've provided $49 million in equity to this organization. This organization reforests degraded pasture land as an example, and then uses the revenues from the carbon credits generated to pay back investors. From our own portfolio, so we have a grant program which I'll talk about, but from our own portfolio, we've seen an increasing proliferation, for example, of blue bonds or debt for nature swaps. You might have heard of some of these concepts. Now, traditional investors in the sovereign debt of various emerging markets tend to be a very narrow set of investors who really buy high-risk sovereign paper. So with a blue bond, what essentially happens, and it can be complex, but what essentially happens is we funded the Nature Conservancy to develop and test out this concept. So the Nature Conservancy comes along, they set up an intermediary. This intermediary raises a bond on the market. At that point in time, Credit Suisse was the originator, arranger, and placement agent for this particular bond. This bond also benefits from the US DFC's credit enhancement mechanism. Now, because the US DFC comes along and provides this credit enhancement mechanism, this opens up the types of investors that can support the bond, because the bond gets a AA2 rating from Moody's. So now the kind of investors who invest in AA paper are a much, much larger set. Now, in turn, because of all of the sort of financial gymnastics and mechanics around this, Gabon, in that case, I'm talking about Belize. Belize, gets all this money from TNC through a loan, goes out and repurchases its own sovereign debt at 55 cents on the dollar, and then reduces its outstanding debt stock by 12%. In turn for all of this, you extract some sort of a conservation concession from the government, and the savings go towards that. So what I'm trying to get at is, through innovative finance, through blended finance, you can open up investment opportunities to institutional investors that would not necessarily be able to participate in these transactions, and that's a heartening development that we've seen over the last year and a half, and we've seen some of these institutional investors here at the forum with us as well.
Fantastic, thanks very much. Interesting examples. Gillian, can I ask the same question to you from your perspective?
Yeah, sure. I think perhaps one of the demand signal that those institutional investors are responding to is the growing demand for deforestation-free products. So as you're surely aware, commodity-driven deforestation and land use is a major driver of the climate crisis. And unless we get deforestation under control, we have zero chance of staying within 1.5. And USAID has really stepped into this space, I think, and engaged in some very creative ways. By way of one example, we worked to establish the community conservancy model in Guatemala, where, as a function of the peace agreements back in the 90s, the Maya biosphere was established. And USAID worked within that biosphere and within those communities, both to monitor deforestation, to ensure that the forest was standing, and to increase the access of those communities to the market. And as a result of that 25-year community conservancy agreement, communities benefited to the tune of about $200 million. And of course, the market had a broader range of sustainably produced products. Similarly, in Asia, through Green Invest Asia, we were able to catalyze over $446 million in investment through a combination of pipeline development, reducing the barriers to investment, and developing a community of practice. Here again, very much responding to the demand signal around the need to reduce deforestation and to address risks in supply chains. For example, coconuts are very much in jeopardy as a function of the climate crisis. And so we convened a series of companies that depend on coconuts. Barry Callebaut, who's a chocolatier, but also sources coconuts, reached out to us, and we were able to bring a range of other companies into the fold to develop a community of practice, both to help do the carbon accounting, to understand the impacts in supply chains, and to figure out how to source more sustainably harvested coconuts. Now, you mentioned gaps as well. I think one of the gaps we have in the market with respect to ensuring finance for nature-based solutions and ensuring a response to this demand signal for deforestation-free products is that there's insufficient data. Companies who make this commitment lack the data and understanding of a very complex supply chain. And frankly, there's not enough transparency and accountability to ensure they're actually abiding by those commitments. So at COP26 in Glasgow, I announced the Forest Data Partnership, which is a collaboration with NASA and Google and the World Resources Institute that's specifically designed to fill the data gap, to enable companies to be able to scrutinize a complex series of supply chains all the way through scope 1, 2, and 3, a range of producers, beyond their immediate control, but for whom they still need to be held accountable if they're going to keep those commitments to be sourcing deforestation-free products. So I think we need that combination of demand signal from consumers, of responsible action by companies, and of the kind of investment you're describing from major institutional investors to further catalyze the progress in the right direction.
Really interesting. I can't resist. It's very interesting to hear, particularly about coconuts, because it's not something, the sector that I hear so often, but not to personalize it, but I have an uncle who had a coconut farm in Mexico, and that was more or less wiped out. So it's interesting to hear that this is an issue that you're looking at. So okay, we've heard, not surprising on this panel, but we've heard a fair bit about forests, and we're obviously sitting in a continent where much of the world's rich forests still lie. And so I think that's a good opportunity to turn to you, Dorothy, and ask for a sort of African perspective on some of these examples, and really to look at some of the opportunities, the unique opportunities that we can find here in the nature and biodiversity space.
Yes, so you speak about Africa, a continent with 65% of its GDP, moderately or highly dependent on nature. We speak about a continent that is assumed to lose about 3% of its GDP as a result of, soil degradation and nutrient depletion. And yet this same continent, about 30% of, the population relies directly on forests and woodlands. I think a component that really gets missing in many of these discussions is the role of the private sector, and so glad we have a conference like this. And for reasons like this, we have the African Natural Capital Alliance, which is basically a collaborative forum of African financial institutions who have come together and said they're going to address the nature challenge. The nature challenge in the context of very little data, the nature challenge in the context of a highly risky political environment, address the nature challenge in the context of very limited awareness, in addition to, of course, frameworks that would be supportive of this kind of investments. So these banks, these financial institutions, these fund managers have come together and they've made specific commitments. Now, many times we think of these commitments as, really fluffy things to talk about. But some of them have actually committed a certain percentage of their basically their balance sheet to support this highly risky, I call it risky because the first thing a risk manager would do when they look at these investments would look at the country risk perspective. And many times, many of these investments will not pass through the risk manager's table. And so these institutions have committed to look at this aspect of nature and the nature challenge in terms of the opportunities presented. Now, I just want to mention very quickly some of the things that we've seen in the continent. I think, Akif, you kind of mentioned the Gabon debt for nature swaps, which unfortunately, very unfortunate about what's going on in Gabon, but was quite a positive aspect, was very positive. It was going to be, it is meant to be the largest debt for nature swap, at least in Africa, and possibly second largest, in the world. We have seen cases where institutions have come together. There's the AFR 100 that seeks to restore 100 million hectares of forest up to 2030. And we have seen private sector players, we have seen a number of development agencies coming and putting in funds to support this. Tomorrow at the Africa Climate Summit, a number of philanthropies, and I won't steal their thunder today, are going to make some major announcements in terms of new funding arrangements for AFR, AFR 100 for at least 3 of the countries, Kenya, Rwanda, and Burundi. So there is a lot that is going on in the continent, in spite of the many challenges that the continent is facing, but specifically financial institutions tomorrow again are going to be making what you call the Nature Voices Pledge, and they're going to actually make verbally make these commitments in terms of what they will do for the continent over the next 10 to 20 years.
Thanks very much. So themes, I guess, themes of risk or areas of challenge. You mentioned, for example, the kind of country risk being a big issue, and also data, I think, is coming across as something which, as an investor, is a challenge, and therefore is a challenge if you're seeking to raise money. And I'd like to go a little bit further on that and ask, so Catherine, to you, when project developers are looking for funding for nature projects, and defining this broadly to include the blue economy, what are some of the obstacles they face? We've already started to hear about those, but maybe you could explore that a bit in depth, and it'd be great to have an example to illustrate it.
Daniel's mentioning the blue economy because I said we never talk about the ocean, so thank you very much. I firstly just wanted to acknowledge what a privilege it is to sit next to you, actually. Thank you so much for those examples, but also for really being someone who's been an inspiring leader in this space. So Dorothy, it's nice to meet you in person. I have to say, when we think about why private capital is not coming into nature, we've probably mentioned most of the reasons on this panel already. It's lack of data, it's a scale issue, it is a counterparty risk challenge when we think about the familiarity of large institutions with big deals, big counterparts, large infrastructure, and the revenue streams that they generate. And I think it would be remiss of me to dwell on those barriers and those challenges, because we all know them, or at least we should in this space. But one challenge that we often don't mention is that the solutions are so bloody complicated. I think, Akif, you said something like financial gymnastics, and I wanted to acknowledge that we can beat the private sector over the head and say you should be investing in nature, and they should. But if the solutions that we offer them are so multi-layered, require so many parties, and have such high transaction costs and low transparency, then they are not solutions which are scalable or fast enough. And the other challenge I think we have in this dynamic, which is wondering why the private sector doesn't invest in nature, is because we aggregate. We talk about nature as one thing, which is of course why I always say don't forget to split out the blue economy, but we talk about the private sector as one thing as well. We've heard that great example from AXA IM investing into Mombak, and we've got the Lightsmith example, which you mentioned earlier, and how cool the lights that kill the bugs. I love it, that's epic, love that. But we are often not talking about large trade finance, bank balance sheets, and just to remind everybody, it's $2.6 trillion a year of bank finance, which is going into sectors that destroy biodiversity. That's more than the GDP of this continent. We have a major challenge if we just look at mainstream capital flows, which are unchecked in a sense. Of course, I know you mentioned this deforestation, the sexiness around stripping deforestation out of your portfolios. And I think the private banks particularly are doing a good job at communicating around the challenges that they have in getting the data to know what they're doing and to know what their existing portfolios are exposed to. But that number, $2.6 trillion, is a number that has been validated and verified, that is going into sectors which destroy biodiversity. So when we talk about the barriers and we ask why these big pools of capital are not going into nature, let's first say what is harming nature needs to stop. I think you asked, of course, for examples which are a bit less depressing. I'm so sorry, I just had to go doom and gloom for a second. But there are really bright spots, and you mentioned it in your introduction, the Global Fund for Coral Reefs, which I had the privilege of working on with some of your GCF colleagues for a while. And that is a structure, one of the largest adaptation blended finance vehicles, which has a layer of first loss, which has grant funding for pipeline development, and which has a commitment to country leadership and community engagement. And that's another major barrier to the private sector coming into these complicated business models. It is because they don't know what they're getting into. And I think, Dorothy, when you talk about the political environment and country risk, that's not specific to nature, but it is exacerbated by this asset class for all the reasons that we know. You've seen a campaign against the carbon markets recently, and when you read stories like Dubai company is buying up half of Liberia to sell carbon credits, you understand why there is real stress around this. And so that's where I'm going to end, I guess, my remarks, which didn't respond to your question at all, Daniel, but it is to say that there is no one piece of this community which can solve for investing in nature. But if we pit different parts of the community against one another, that means governments against private sector, against MDBs, against solution providers and entrepreneurs, we will not move fast. We will not move at scale. And they're the buzzwords of this conference, so I'm apologizing for using them here. But we do need to move faster, and we do need to move in bigger, scalable, and simple structures. It takes this transaction point to play because it's not just the private sector that's struggling with complex financing mechanisms. It is the communities who are the stewards of these ecosystems. If it takes me, a neuroscience degree, to unpick Keith's structure of the blue bond, then imagine what it means to be a community who's trying to negotiate the benefit sharing arrangements. So the private sector is not coming in because of data shortages, because of small counterparts, because they're scared of countries that they don't know how to operate in. Those solutions are solvable with a guarantee for nature, a dedicated de-risking facility for nature. Let's do that. We know how to do that. Let's learn from the energy and infrastructure space and do that. But most importantly, let's not forget that the barriers to access and the barriers to play are greatest for the stewards of nature. And I'm looking at Sue Reed, who advises Christiana Figueres on climate finance, and she will say this much more eloquently than I ever could, so please go find her later. But it is those communities that we need to have in mind, even in a conversation about unlocking institutional capital.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I think it's the privilege of everybody on a panel to answer the better question you wanted, and not necessarily. Yeah, no, that's great. It was very interesting. I wanted to take the same question and ask you, Lace, because I think we just heard you're really going through fundraising as we speak, and or not in this instant, but very recently, and I think it's interesting to hear that perspective, which perhaps differs from many of the rest of us on the panel.
Great. So LinfTech, we did Series A, B, C. We did some low ones with the private market. So far in our history, we were able to raise roughly $200 million. And I can say that only the 23 million came from the green investors. So until now, we needed to adapt and focus our storytelling to technology to attract that capital. That's how we were able to capture all these investments through our history. And speaking from my knowledge in Brazil, I use it to work at private equity firms there. And the thing that I think that is lacked the most is education on the impacts on nature. We hear from Samir today with the charts about the impacts, and I believe that the general market, financial market, the general private equities, venture capitals, And again, talking from Brazil, that's my main experience. I have also some experience fundraising in the US, but they don't truly understand what is the impact, so they don't see what are the risks and potentials on companies like us to drive more, to offer more capital to companies like us. So I imagine it's a huge job for you all on how to drive, to make it mainstream with the financial markets, on how they are going to frame the risks and also analyze the potentials of those companies, include that in the evaluation of those companies, and gather more investments to those companies. So all the time we could fundraise, and with the Lightsmith experience, and it's getting, good news is it's getting traction. So in the past 2 years, we are finding more and more green investor funds finding us and being interested. And right now I can say there is a higher traction and demand for companies to invest in assets like Solinftech. So it's here, it's it. So education and how they will be able, how you guys could make it able to mainstream how they analyze companies like us to have a higher offer of investments and drive future technologies to change the impacts we see as of today.
Great, thanks. So positive momentum there, and it sounds like you know, the increase of green investors means that people are finding you. Sort of on the same theme, but stepping back to something more generalizable. Zheng, I wanted to ask you, what are the projects which, in your view, are having success in raising funding? And yeah, from your perspective, what are some of the factors, the common factors, if you like, that have contributed to their success? You know, looking at are there things that we can replicate, other things that that we can look out for, generalizable lessons?
Thank you. Well, I work for UNEP, and you probably think why UNEP is here and the private sector investment. But in our team, we actually do work quite closely with some impact fund managers and also commercial banks, helping them to set up some funds and facilities, and especially helping them actually establishing or strengthening their environment and social framework and impact framework. So through the interactions with them, what we've seen is, with a few exceptions, it seems like the market or the industry is still not mature enough to support the pure play project developers. And many of those who are playing this role now are often with NGO or conservation background. And what we've noticed is also the success rate in terms of building an investment project is actually quite poor. To us, what we see as one key success factors in project development is actually the early stage and also intensive involvement from the investor or the fund managers. And so this is basically ensure that the project is developed within their expectations. And then, when the project matures, it actually receives the investment. And this is one of the reasons we actually set up the Restoration Seed Capital Facility, or RSCF, in UNEP. So this is basically a preparation facility where we provide the support to impact fund managers and investment advisors. And RSCF, they support in different stages with the cost sharing and also repayable grant. It can help fund managers to do their fundraising and do the pipeline project development. So this RSCF was launched in 2020, and so far we've onboarded 4 impact investors, and then some of them have already had a successful project closed. So through managing them and then interacting with them, what we notice is even with this early stage involvement, early stage support, there is still actually significant challenges in the project development phase. So the actual success factors in each project is very context specific. But one thing that's in common in many of the cases is actually the underground capacity and expertise. And this is not just in the project development phase, but also in implementation. And then the other, I guess, success factors from the RSCF perspective is actually a solid revenue model. There is significant or growing interest in carbon revenues, but it's still quite volatile and subject to regulatory risks. So from what we've seen, a mixed revenue model, which has a combination of commodity production and also carbon, can actually offer more protection on the downside risk. And it's also more attractive to investors. So I guess going forward, we may see some blueprints of some typical type of projects in the sector, but it's very likely that certain degrees of complexity and also the context specificity will still remain. So what we think, what will still very essential to make sure the fundraising part is successful is early stage engagement and also on the ground capacity.
Okay, thanks. And Aki, if I wanted to bring you in on the same issue, I think you've got a really interesting perspective in terms of what you've seen work, how you've, both on the structuring side, but also what kind of projects do you find are moving and generating appetite from investors?
So getting transactions supported on a purely commercial basis in low and middle income countries is really, really hard. It doesn't matter about this particular sector, about any sector. This sector, even harder. So what do? You analyze the risks, you try to strip away a range of the risks, but how do you actually strip away those specific risks? The transactions that we've seen in nature that have seen some sort of commercial investment over time in low and middle income countries are the ones that have benefited from some sort of blended finance mechanism, some sort of de-risking mechanism. We heard that this morning with Acumen's Resilience in Agriculture Fund. You mentioned the Global Fund for Coral Reefs has a blended finance structure. So when you combine some sort of technical assistance, where you have some sort of a guarantee wrap, when you have capital within the capital structure to alter the risk-return ratio for more commercially oriented investors, what you're essentially doing is you are stripping away some of those risks that preclude those investors from investing otherwise. Now, we can do this transaction by transaction, which is really, really hard to do. You mentioned transaction costs are quite high as well. So what I think really is effective is, can we get together perhaps an aggregation pool of catalytic capital that can then go and take on all these specific risks? One of the facilities that we've supported from our climate catalytic design funding window, which we recently launched with the Australian government, the Canadian government, and the Gates Foundation, is an initiative called Colibri Catalyst. They're looking to raise $150 million plus of pure concessional catalytic capital, and this facility will allocate this across direct deals in terms of patient equity, to intermediary fund managers who need some of that capital to be tranched in their own fund structure, or into real assets. So instead of having donors, or instead of having these folks go individual case by case, many of them not present on the ground even, it's much more effective to aggregate and to do it in this particular manner. But the transactions that we've seen really get off the ground need to strip away those risks, and therefore need to be blended in some way, shape, or form.
Okay, thanks. That's really interesting, and obviously music to our ears. It sounds like we still have a role if the blended finance and risk mitigation is a key to success. So that's very good to hear. And the aggregation is also something I think we very much agree with. It's interesting. It also brings its challenges then in terms of, as we were hearing about data, and really, obviously everybody wants exposure to the real exposure to the individual, but it's a very interesting area. So, okay, this is kind of talking about what's successful for project developers to attract finance. And then I'd like to kind of flip to the opposite end of this telescope, if you like, Catherine. for investors, going out there, looking for projects, looking for things to invest in. We've heard about aggregation platforms, and that's surely part of the answer, but I'd love to hear your take on what are the challenges they face, but also what's working.
I think investors want to understand the underlying business model, but we, again, aggregate that term. So maybe this group particularly, as we communicate, and I agree, we really do need to educate, communicate, help demystify this space. But it is to talk about the business models rather than nature as the whole asset class. So am I an institutional investor buying a bunch of real estate, basically, and turning it into a carbon play? Or am I a corporate looking at my commodity supply chains that I want to make more regenerative, strip out deforestation, invest in some of the infrastructure, better cold chain storage or intensification? Am I in that philanthropic or catalytic territory where I'm talking about conservation and I'm experimenting with, different versions of payments for ecosystem services? Am I a straight up waste management person because I'm trying to reduce some of that agricultural runoff into waters, into fresh or our ocean waters? And I think that is where we will start to shift this conversation, whether it's with institutionals, with some of the private equity players, with the banks, and with some of those developers who are also looking to attract capital. I think the best thing, in fact, that we can do on top of that disaggregation of business models is actually support the intermediaries. And those intermediaries which channel catalytic capital from a donor, you mentioned a few there, I'm glad the Aussies are doing something right, and trying to get that funding to the entrepreneurs who are building these pioneering business models and supporting with technical assistance so that they don't show up to an investor at any part of the spectrum and say, I've got a great idea, but it doesn't look and feel like something you're used to evaluating. And this is back to your point. It's got to look like somebody already knows what they're seeing, because we're dealing with people who are not incentivized necessarily to be courageous, and we're dealing with often people who are, herd animals, finance guys. They're not always trying to push the envelope, and that's where we come back to some of the transaction costs. But I really think you mentioned Colibri. Another example is Partnerships for Forests, which was a UK government-funded technical assistance program. Donors, big funders, can't always operate on the ground at the grant level of, tens of thousands of dollars. But that is how, by supporting those intermediaries and streamlining that intermediation function, we're also going to help get big capital to where it needs to be.
Thank you. I think, so I'd like to, I'm mixing up the order of things here because I think it's, there's some themes that are worth pursuing. So Gillian, similar kind of question to you in terms of what's worked and what the mechanisms are that is working to attract investors into the space. But in particular, I'd love to get your perspective on, so there's been a slew of mixed reviews of carbon in the press recently. The Guardian in particular has been on a tear about this. I'd love to hear your perspective of what the role, generally blended financing mechanisms, but really honing in on carbon finance and its role in bringing finance into this space.
Sure. Well, you made reference to the pending deal between the UAE and Liberia for massive stores of blue carbon, a deal that I think is causing a lot of consternation and hasn't involved the kind of consultation that would be necessary to withstand legal scrutiny. On a related note, this morning when I was with Special Envoy Kerry meeting with a range of NGOs about their concerns regarding equity and carbon finance, one woman, African woman, put it very bluntly. She said, most women and many men in Africa don't have land tenure. So if you're talking about commoditizing nature, how are they gonna accrue benefits in the context of those transactions? So there's a lot of money at stake, and there are a lot of legitimate concerns, both with respect to investors because of the very real reputational risks about whether there's this additionality, whether there's been sufficient consultation, and with the fact that the integrity and the transparency and the equity of these markets, especially in the voluntary market, is just not where it needs to be. So notwithstanding all of those challenges, and the Guardian series, I think, was quite influential, especially with respect to Vera, of course. USAID sees a role for us to play here because carbon is being commoditized. You reference it as a diverse range of revenue stream alongside the actual commodities that you're selling. This is happening. Perhaps not in a scope and scale that it might be if we had addressed the issues of integrity and transparency and equity, but it is happening. We live in a world in which we're starting to commoditize nature. And frankly, the biggest problem with our system writ large and capitalism is that we've never valued what's valuable. So this isn't necessarily a bad thing. What is a bad thing is a scenario where we're not really adding value in the context of these investments. We're not actually reducing carbon emissions, and we're not recognizing that we can't credit our way out of this crisis. First and foremost, we need deep decarbonization. These interventions should only be to address the hardest to abate sectors. Before I close, and USAID has been engaging, we've been providing technical assistance to the government of Kenya in shaping the latest amendments to its climate law, which has new provisions regarding carbon markets. You'll be hearing more about that from President Ruto. We're going to announce some work we're doing with Mozambique on front because we want to be at the table, because we want to protect those communities and ensure that there actually is community benefit for these initiatives. But I want to speak for a minute to a project I saw just yesterday that the Green Climate Fund and Acumen have invested in that struck me as quite an innovative model. And it's one that's integrating carbon finance into to reduce the price for the end user. So this is this group called Sistema Bio that is basically manufacturing a large plastic sack, which is buried, partially buried on a smallholder farm's plot. And it takes, you basically shovel in the manure, which is then processed through this sack to reduce the methane emissions, which of course highly toxic, short-lived climate pollutant, and produce biogas, which is then used for cooking in lieu of charcoal or wood, which would cause much more pollutants in the air, difficulties with respiratory function, and deforestation. And the way they're, this whole, oh, and by the way, the sleuth that's coming out after the biogas has been produced is in turn being used as fertilizer, which is replacing chemical fertilizers. So it's reducing the farmer's expense, and it's substantially increasing yield. So they're making more money on their crops. They're having a healthier home. They're reducing methane emissions. And the cost is being made affordable by virtue of the fact that the company is selling credits pertinent to the reduction in methane emissions as a result of this intervention, and those are verifiable reductions. So it's an interesting different way of modeling community benefit, whereby sometimes the sale of carbon, legitimate sale of carbon, where there's actual verifiable interventions which are adding value, the benefits can be passed along to consumers who can in turn increase their own yield and their own profitability.
Thank you, and great to hear. Always good to hear an example from GCF. I think there's a really nice segue there. Because I think we may have just heard the tweetable quote of the panel that we haven't valued what's valuable, and I think that's a really interesting point to turn to Dorothy, because Dorothy's got a great perspective on this. So we've been talking about carbon. Carbon obviously is largely driven at the moment by the sort of net zero pledges and all of that. at the moment it's largely not being regulated, but I think this is a really good point to jump in and talk about, what role should regulation play in incentivizing nature-positive investments. Be really interested to hear a perspective from TNFD framework and how that's incentivizing private sector engagement with natural capital. And really, where do we go from here? You have a unique perspective on that, I think.
I think, to be frank, let's start by looking at regulations in the context of national policies. And, for the African context specifically at FSD, what we're doing, we are supporting 5 African countries to develop national nature strategies. Of course, that includes their national biodiversity strategies and action plans and 30 by 30 plans. And it's interesting because we've just started having workshops with one of the countries. And at that workshop, as you go through the process of setting the national nature strategies, you also cover some of the aspects that should be included in regulation. And a line that always sticks out is, remove harmful subsidies. That's a very difficult topic for some governments. Why? Because for a continent that is highly dependent on agriculture, fertilizer is key. And how you get re-elected and how you get back, how you get re-elected is making sure the farmers are happy. And so that means you have to make fertilizer very affordable, and that means you have to subsidize fertilizer. And that means that, at times it may go against conservation principles or practices that these countries want to adopt. So it's a tough balance trying to look at, sustainability in terms of conservation or biodiversity protection, ensuring economic growth, and at the same time just, doing the right thing. And so regulation comes in, I want to say that regulation comes in largely based on the foundations that these countries and these governments are putting in place in terms of the national nature strategies, like I've mentioned. And this comes in terms of creating an enabling environment, the tax breaks that, many of these countries are looking at. We've talked about the benefits sharing under the carbon credits. Regulations that, at least I can mention 2 countries, Kenya and Tanzania, have been looking at. And then going back to the communities in terms of what they gain out of all these transactions that we are seeing. But in terms of frameworks that, again, are supportive of any type of foundations that need to be built, there's a TNFD, which will be launched on the 18th of September at the New York Climate Week. And at the African Natural Capital Alliance, what we have been doing is we set an Africa pilot group for TNFD. And basically that means that, we had a number of financial institutions who are testing the beta framework of the TNFD, gave feedback on the framework, and also gave recommendations. And if you look at the kind of feedback given, again, the data challenge comes in. If you look at the feedback given, the taxonomies, within this continent, the framework talks about certain taxonomies or certain ways of defining certain things. But you engage with financial institutions, and the first thing you tell them is, you need to understand, you use words like biomes, and you use words like nature positive. And the first thing they ask you is, what do you mean by that? And so they're expected to disclose the risks, and they're of course expected to do opportunity assessments, but the very basic foundations they don't have an understanding of. And so that is part of the reason why through this Africa pilot group, those are some of the challenges that were picked, and certain recommendations given. For example, a main recommendation from that pilot group was, to allow the African entities to start with the foundations pack, or a light version, and not light to make it, to water down what the framework requires, but light in the context of looking at the African context and being able to support these financial institutions to make their first disclosures. And I'm just talking about financial institutions in that case. Of course, there are many other institutions who would use the TNFD. And one of the other challenges that you'd see is Climate has been a big focus area, and much of the funding, much of the attention, including of private sector players, has been more on the climate side. So when you start talking about nature and introducing seemingly new content, without fully explaining the intersection or the nexus between nature and climate, then it becomes a very difficult conversation to drive through. And so at the Africa Pilot Group, again, has been engaging these African financial institutions and help them fully understand the nexus between nature and climate, understand, and for them to fully understand the risks that their books or their transactions or the processes or products that they have in terms of the nature crisis and the contributions that they have. But more importantly, and every time we'd have that workshop, when you do the opportunity assessment with them, then suddenly they get to realize that there are new things that they could do. They had never thought, many of them had never thought about biodiversity credits. I know carbon credits already have a challenge, and then here comes biodiversity credits, which again still, of course, has a bit of time, will take a bit of time to fully get appreciated and of course adopted. But what we're saying is, through the TNFD and through the Africa pilot groups, and there have been many pilot groups across the globe, the ability in our context to be able to contextualize the framework, contextualize the challenges that we face as a continent, the data challenge, a big one, and then able to almost in a way use that process as a way of capacity building for financial institutions. Then it becomes much easier for them with time to start looking at nature-based financial solutions and also to start relooking at their investments. Many of these insurance companies, many of these institutions are actually big, some of the largest institutional investors in this, on the continent. And so for them to even have a clear understanding on where to push capital, then it means that there's a big foundation that needs to be, relooked at. Yeah.
Okay, no, that's great. And so you mentioned a big challenge of data and the importance of understanding the risks and contributions, all of which obviously relies on data. So I think that's a good time. Zhengzhou, I'd like to ask you, what are some of the data challenges, and what's the role of science here in sort of starting to help us answer Dorothy's question? What do you mean by that? And what are the remaining gaps? What are we doing to fill them?
Sure. Well, I think in general, like the nature science is very clear in terms of where we need to go and what we need to do. But it gets complicated when we look at this social science, and especially when we're looking at the finance flows going into nature positive outcomes, and then also how do you actually measure the impact, from those nature positive funds. So obviously data is actually a big issue here. The quality of data, and it's also sometimes there's just no data at all. And that has been mentioned by several panels here. And what we've seen is a lot of data is collected and reported in a less systematic manner. So there's no common like frameworks or standards or methodologies. So it also makes it difficult or if it's not impossible to compare among different impact investors. And also, like, there's actually a growing number of impact investors that really want to make sense of their impact data. And then they also want to know how to integrate the impact measurement and management into their portfolio. There's different organizations doing that, but there's definitely a lot of support, a lot of guidance is still needed, and to provide in the way industry standards or principles. And then the second point, I think, was mentioned actually by Dorothy already, is the regulation. Is absolutely important. And I want to, I guess, a small correction. So Daniel, you mentioned the UNEP State of Finance for Nature report, mentioned the 133 billion US dollars invested in nature. That's actually the data for 2021. So we've seen a slightly increase in 2022. So that's a slight, I guess, good news. And then you also mentioned the majority is from public sector, which is true. This is including the domestic public and also ODA. So clearly there is a big potential for private sector. But because of the risks we've talked about, and because of the high, the time consuming for project development, and it's also the, the complexity in investment in nature in general, there's definitely a need from the government to support the private sector in terms of regulation, in terms of concessional and blended finance, and also, a high integrity nature market. So that's definitely, we need to encourage and provide more support. But at the same time, we also cannot expect the private sector to do everything. There is a big role for the government, not just to provide the enabling environment to the private sector, but also what they need to do. And Dorothy also mentioned the environmental harm subsidies. So in the report, in the 2022 figure, we see the 154 that's potentially nature positive, but the nature negative is actually 7 times more. So in the quest for mobilizing more investment in nature, there's definitely something we still need to do in reforming and repurposing those investments. And there is a big gap for us to meet by 2030, by 2050. So it's not the lack of capital, it's not the lack of funds. Many times is how you prioritize where do you invest. And the real promise of impact investment in nature is to prove that there is a business case. It can be competitive, it can be profitable in sustainable use of nature. Sustainable land use is a big topic. And we need to demonstrate that we can still produce the commodities that the humanity needs, but then at the same time, with a much more improved environment and social benefits and outcome. All of this need to be integrated into regulations. And progressively, there should also be raising the standard of what is not allowed, and also the standard of how to sustainable use. And only when those happens, then we can actually see a real impact investment in nature and can be achieved at the scale.
Okay, that's really interesting. And one of the points you made, which I noted down, is the difficulty of comparing across these kind of vastly heterogeneous sets of data. We're bundling a whole bunch of stuff into this theme, no? So I think, Catherine, I'd like to ask you there, how should investors be valuing it? How should they be valuing the different contributions that these investments make beyond just the simple financial valuation, given that this is a really complex area?
Very happy to come in on that one, but Dorothy, did you want to? Because I suspect you're looking at that all the time. Great, so I guess the first thing is that we should not expect investors to go against what they are set up to do. So they will fall back on fiduciary duty, or they will sort of talk about their obligations, and that's good. That takes us into the territory which Dorothy's been mentioning around regulation. We've seen some courageous regulation. Pension funds in the UK now have to consider climate risk, for example. But if we said the entire private sector will wake up tomorrow and believe that every investment that they make must take into account the extinction of a certain species in a geography where they don't invest, we're kidding ourselves. And I'm only so blunt because sometimes I think that's where different communities clash as well. I'm as tree hugger hippie as it gets emotionally, but if we are talking to big financial institutions, as so many people on this panel have said, we need methodologies and frameworks to measure and evaluate, but also to monetize. And that's where we get into the complicated space of disaggregating. Is it just carbon? Is it water quality? You mentioned biodiversity credits. What about the social implications? And so your question, Daniel, I'm always dodging them, but it is a really, really important one. It is just not necessarily one that will be solved with a single metric. And that is fundamentally, at its most crude, the difference why we're having a nature discussion versus a climate discussion, because the purity of boiling down a metric to a ton of carbon is so much easier than the interconnected and interrelated natural capital spectrum that we're dealing with here. I mentioned a few examples earlier in the ocean space, and you might think if I was speaking to an investor about the blue economy, that they'd instantly be thinking about sustainable fisheries or aquaculture, some kind of technology solution to sustainably farm salmon to feed the next billion people with protein, something cool like that. But actually, you may be talking about land-based interventions, waste management, avoiding agricultural runoff, behavior on land with the implications for oceans. And this comes back to, I think, something we were talking about earlier, which is expertise. This stuff is complicated, and you've got super nerds who are looking at not just the oceans, but seaweed solutions in the oceans, talking about packaging or how to use seaweed to reduce methane emissions of cattle, for example. But if we expect our investor community, as aggregated as we do, to be experts across the minutiae of different biodiversity and nature components, and to be able to understand that without the ability to measure it and without those standardized frameworks, then we're in trouble. And that's why what the TNFD is doing is so important. That's why education is so important. But fundamentally, I think it is also a conversation about time horizon. Because as soon as you look at your capital in anything longer than a couple of years, then of course you can start to see that investments which degrade biodiversity may have devastating implications for your returns, for your social license to operate, for your ability to generate potentially carbon credits. But if you've got someone who's incentivized on making money within a year or a quarter and reporting on that, then these impacts don't happen in those time incrementals often, unless you've got wildfires wiping out half of my country and lots of others. But these challenges, I think, are more fundamental to the financial system than they are actually when we disaggregate them in these conversations. And it is why we have to be chameleons in a sense. We have to talk at the financial system level, we have to talk at the investor level, we have to talk at the micro level about the individual nature-based metrics that we are trying to measure. But this point about valuing, that will only come when we have that systemic review of our economic model fundamentally. And I don't know if you want me to go there on this panel, but that's a really, really big question and we need to tackle it.
No, that's great. And indeed, Dorothy, that could have also been a question very much in your area of expertise. But I think actually Catherine set us up nicely for what I did want to ask you about as well, which was knowledge sharing. Because the work you're doing, I think, gives you, a really interesting perspective here. So what are the opportunities for knowledge sharing and capacity building that can eventually result in greater finance flowing to this area?
Yeah, like I started by saying, engaging with financial institutions, and the first thing they ask is, what do you mean by nature positive? It may sound very basic to all of us in this room, but for the decision makers, some of these investors, they typically have no understanding whatsoever of that particular aspect. And increasingly, within the continent, we are seeing banks, we're seeing insurance companies suddenly, scrambling for environmental scientists and heads of biodiversity to join the risk teams, because there is a sudden realization that science is a very key part of finance going forward. And I think the challenge, or maybe the beauty of it, is suddenly there is a need for a very serious interdisciplinary, connection or knowledge, knowledge sharing ability across science, I think I liked what one of our panelists said. Social sciences comes in, law comes in, the legal side of it, the law comes in. Technology is a key component. I mean, we've just seen an excellent video on how to bring in technology into this space. So you're seeing, of course, the political science part of it, and then finance, for which most of us are very well versed in. So the potential for capacity building largely lies in the ability to create, individuals or key decision makers who have a very good understanding of the science part and the finance part, and all these other components that are very, important for this particular topic. So what we are doing at the African Natural Capital Alliance is we've come up with a nature and biodiversity finance leadership program, and it's really targeting the executives within institutions, because at the end of the day, they are the influencers. They have the ability to drive strategy. And what we want to do is create 100 change champions, nature champions across the continent. And we're putting them together. We are bringing the finance experts together, the lawyers together, the tech people together, the scientists in one room, and taking them through a one-year program, basically to try and build capacity, because we've come to the realization that this cannot move if science is not talking to finance, and is not talking to tech, and is not talking to law. So somehow all this, all these pieces need to start talking in a language that they all understand, so that when they go to their boards, or when they go to, the investors, they're actually able to convince them and persuade them on why the nature agenda should be taken into consideration, why it's really important. Again, the finance people need to be able to answer the community question. They will not be able to answer that. They won't be able to answer the aspect of, local and indigenous people and communities if they don't understand a part of it. And so that's really what we want to do. Capacity building is key, and it's one of the key focus areas of the African Natural Capital Alliance.
Really interesting, thank you. So I think we've heard a lot about some of the challenges and also some of the interesting work that's going on. And I'd like to turn for the rest of the panel. Last question, or in-depth question, really just looking forward. So, and I'll ask this one to Gillian and Akif. So maybe Gillian, starting with you. Going back to the point we started on about blended finance. How should this be evolving? How should this be changing? Going forwards so that we can get to the scale that we need to get here?
Well, I think we need the 3 Ps, listening to everybody here today, right? First, we need policy. For God's sake, if you can put a price on carbon, please, would you? Our government is obviously not going to do that, but it's the obvious solution in this situation, talking about pricing what's valuable and taxing what's toxic. So first and foremost, we need policy interventions. Included amongst them, for example, speaking of the climate finance gap, let's stop subsidizing fossil fuels and our own suicide. We're talking about 2.6 trillion in investments that are destroying nature, and we've got a looming climate finance gap of $3 to $5 trillion. We invested $7 trillion in fossil fuel subsidies in 2022, according to the most recent IMF report. This is insanity, purely insane. So let's start with policy. President Biden put forward several subsidy-free budgets to our Congress. They were not passed as such, as we know, but that's what we need. We need that kind of political leadership, and we need action on that front. Secondly, so policy is the first piece. Secondly, we need proof. Everybody here is talking about how we need to make the case in terms that investors understand. USAID launched a private sector call to action. We've recruited over 20 companies that understand the value of adapting their own products, services, and footprints to respond to the climate crisis. And one of those companies is BCG, the Boston Consulting Group, that will launch a report at COP28 on the business case for adaptation, which is so important. We need proof, and we need the same kind of things with respect to nature-based interventions. Finally, this was also mentioned throughout the panel, we need pipeline. We need investable pipeline. Once we've got the policies which can incentivize investments in the right direction, the proof that it's financially viable, and not just that, lucrative, we need the pipeline. We have our partners from the Climate Finance Development Accelerator. That's a new USAID initiative specifically focused on cultivating pipeline and enabling USAID and other bilaterals to use their dollars in ways that are concessional and that catalyze 5 or 10 or 20x the investment that we can make with the precious public sector dollars that we have. So I'd encourage you to talk to our colleagues from Pollination and the Climate Finance Development Accelerator if you're an investor or if you feel you have projects worth investing in. Thanks.
Thank you. That's great. Akiva, I can put the same question to you.
So I'm going to unpick that third P, which is pipeline, because this panel is about investment. And risk and returns are the paradigms along which investors make capital allocation decisions. Doesn't matter what we think. Now, when it comes to pipeline, the big issue is a function of return. There's just how do we have and how do you create the business models that have the cash flows that can pay back those investors? How do you create a revenue stream around mangrove restoration? How do you create a revenue stream around building a dry seawall in a community that needs that dry seawall? So with the support of very many donor governments, Australia, Canada, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, the UBS Optimus Foundation, we have created a bunch of different pipeline curation windows wherein we tell the community like Pollination, like Aligned Intermediary, like others, like Conservation International, give us your best ideas. We are in possession of scarce donor capital, and the best way to allocate this is through an auction-based process. So we want to see the best ideas because these ideas need to have and need to create and curate for this investable pipeline. I'll give you an example. We supported something in Indonesia called the Restoration Insurance Service Company. This is a social enterprise. It'll raise financing on a blended finance package basis, and the money will go towards protection and restoration of mangroves. Where is the financing model, you might ask? So there's two revenue sources here. Number one is that fees will be paid by insurance companies with exposure to coastal assets for the risk reduction benefits of those mangroves. So that is one revenue stream that you build around this sort of idea. And the second revenue stream is the sale of blue carbon credits on the voluntary carbon markets. So we really struggle to see sort of the right investable models. And that pipeline is really critical because once we put the pipeline in front of the investors, can we have that conversation? So if you have a great idea, please come to us, apply for this particular grant that we have, and we'll be happy to engage in a discussion with you.
Fantastic. Us too. If you have a great idea, I think we're also very keen. So I'd like now to, we've all been sitting on these not so comfortable chairs for a while. We should bring the panel to a close, but I'd like to ask everybody just for a really quick soundbite of a call to action, and this can really be either for GCF, what should we be doing more, or just for the community in general. And my apologies to the last two questions because it's a little bit the same, but I think just a short soundbite version of where we need to go. So Lais, can I start with you?
So what do we want to see more, right? In terms
what
of
should GCF be doing more of, or just generally what should the community of practice, if you like, be doing more?
Yeah, for sure. So providing more visibility for companies like we presented here in terms of understanding what we do and making these connections. So being here today is great. It's a great opportunity because we can show to you the type of technology we are looking to in terms of transforming how farming operations happen today. So connections and understanding how we could apply the technology in different markets. We truly believe that is not only supposed to be in South and North America markets. We truly believe we can rethink how farming operations are happening. So connections in order to understand potential partnerships, also investing, would be great.
Thank you very much. Gillian, if I can.
For this planet to survive and thrive, we need to value what's valuable and tax what's toxic.
I like it. Zheng Zheng.
Well, I think everyone would agree with me that we don't have time. We don't have the luxury of time of business as usual, or we don't even have time to wait for the data. We talked about the lack of data. And someone said, and I quote, it just takes some guts to just start and do it, and take the risks and then learn on the job. So, I mean, I guess the call for GCF is then those, impact investors, they are actually, many of them, they're willing to sacrifice certain percentage of profit in exchange of impact, but they cannot do it alone. They definitely need a lot of support, and they need support from not just the financiers, but in terms of GCF, there's obviously, could be more flexible, could be more speedy, and take more risks in general. And having worked for GCF before, I know the secretary is working really hard on improving all of this, but it's very much needed. And then, beyond GCF, the community here, I think also everyone, has a role to play. There's always, something you can do to help mobilize more investment in nature.
Thanks very much. Okay.
Two calls to action: support intermediaries to deploy catalytic capital to de-risk or shift risk around projects, and portfolio solutions much better for scale and mobilization.
Great. Catherine.
Don't reinvent the wheel. If tech attracts capital, let's look at tech solutions. If we know that guarantees tackle political and country risk, let's design the guarantee for nature. So don't reinvent the wheel.
Dorothy.
And with everything that we've said, we need to contextualize the solutions, even within the continent. And this is to project developers. A conservation project in Namibia where land use or land pressure is not a challenge will never be the same with a conservation project in Kenya. And so it's very important that in the context, we take into consideration the context.
Thank you so much. I'm just checking on the time, and I think we've got about a few minutes more. So if, but not very many minutes more. But if there are any questions that anybody would have, please stand up, and I think you'll get a microphone. And maybe if you could say your name, your affiliation, and if you're addressing the question to anybody in particular. And maybe I think, given the relatively limited time, I'll take sort of 2 questions or 3, and then we'll answer them.
My name is Constance Hunt. I'm with the Quench Project, and I'm just reflecting on the need to systematically rethink our economic model, because there's been a lot of reference to commodity production, and the idea of having standard units in large quantities is what drives stock markets still in a lot of the world. But as some of our panelists have pointed out, nature is complex, and it's a series of nodes that are interconnected. What we're trying to do with one of our projects is to make those nodes real on the ground, because that's what fits with the realities of these communities, these ultimate stewards of the natural resources that are interdependent on the ecosystems that surround them. And that means having not just one slate of one production where if there are bugs in it, you go out and you zap them with electricity instead of poisoning them. What you have is a series of interrelated commodity chains that are supporting each other and supporting the natural functions of the adjacent ecosystem. In this case, it's the Kakamega rainforest, which is Kenya's only tropical rainforest. And so my question to the panel is it possible in your mind to use the fact that we're in the information age, and this was alluded to in the last panel when it was Jacqueline, I think was her name. She was talking about the industrial age, and we get a lot of flack in the north, about the industrial age and all its impacts, but we wouldn't have this hotel if we didn't have the industrial age and internal combustion engines. So we need to move around that. And in Africa, there's a tremendous potential for using the information age, which is where we are now, to connect those nodes with what is the local context on the ground, those local ecosystems, so that you have interconnection. For example, on our farms, farmers are producing mushrooms, and they have apiaries, and they're growing native hardwood trees that are native to the forest. And the first two value chains subsidize the second one, which takes 30 years to mature. But once they do mature, you have nice, fine furniture instead of telephone poles. So what you have to do, really, to rethink the system, and we're a long way away from it, is look at it as a bunch of interconnected nodes and make that system fit what is actually on the ground.
Okay, thank you very much. And did I see another two hands? So maybe if we can take, and if you could try and be relatively quick in the questions, then we'll take the three together.
Oh gosh, that's quite loud. Mohammed Badisi, I'm an advisor to the U.S. government Power Africa program, but also a researcher and academic in the space. I'm a law professor. And I just want to both celebrate the discussion of data here and the necessity of data, but also challenge and ask the panel, you know, for example, the Forest Data Initiative has done a wonderful job of having an open source sort of database for that forest data. But when it comes to contracts, none of these institutions publish their contracts. When it comes to financial documents, none of these institutions publish their bond terms, their financing terms. When it comes to economic models, none of these institutions publish their economic models. I think we're treating data too narrowly as a term, and so the very basic question here is, if you want all of us to compare notes, like us lawyers, we need to see your work, your notes first. And so just to put that out there, I don't think we're being ambitious enough with that data disclosure target. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And I think there was another question over here.
Hi, good evening, good afternoon. My name is Kamal Hassan. I'm a farmer with a small agribusiness company called Wama Group. My question is directed to Ms. Lace from Brazil. I like the farming solutions you presented here, especially the robots and the sprayers. I'm wondering if these solutions are available to African farmers and if they are affordable. If not, are any of these funders willing to fund such technology for African farmers? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. So we started our technology learning from large operations. And right now, through the Solix platform, we are driving everything that we learned to small farm owners. It's becoming more and more adapted to small farms. So the video I showed you guys, it's a 20-hectare farm. We initially focus in row crops, citrus, coffee, and sugarcane. And we are adapting now for fruits and vegetables. And for sure, we believe that in order to achieve the food productivity needs for the planet in the next 30 years, we must increase food yields in Africa. So we are here and to partner and to meet what are the challenges of the market, and we wish to bring our technology here in the next few years. And for that, we will need financing. So just pitching, we will need financing for that, for sure. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We're really down to the last few minutes. So I think that the question, one of the questions there was about should we be more ambitious on, or should we broaden the scope of data? I don't think it was asked to anybody in particular, so I'll ask for volunteers if anybody'd like to address that. Should we be publishing our contracts? Gillian, please.
Well, I think the move towards, from the Task Force for Carbon Disclosure, the TCFD, and more broadly forcing companies to spell out what the future looks like in a world in which fossil fuel consumption is constrained, and their products or the supply chains on which they depend may be compromised is just incredibly important. And I think it goes back to the earlier point about the real problem of an economy based on quarterly reporting. We need to have a longer term time horizon, and we need, just in the way that companies forecast on a longer term basis in their own business planning, we need more visibility into that. And as consumers And as investors, we're entitled to more visibility for publicly traded companies with respect to what their future looks like given their product line.
Okay, I think we better draw a line under it, make way for the next one. But it's been such a pleasure. It's really been very interesting. My very sincere thanks to the panel, and it would be great if everybody could join me in thanking them for all their insights that they brought to this.